heard it in the doorway before the sunlight touched her face. A sentence as casual and final as a gavel fall, spoken without heat, as if reading from a brief. "It would have made everything so much simpler," he said, voice low enough to seem conspiratorial, loud enough to carry to the bed where Elena lay immobile and listening. A monitor ticked. The room was folded into a slice of late-morning light, dust motes turning like small, indifferent jurors. Elena's hand lay against the thin blanket, fingers slightly curled as if holding evidence. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. She did not move. She did not cry. She catalogued instead. The cadence of his speech, the way he avoided her name, the precise vocabulary of someone trained to negotiate risk even in private conversation. He had once been the person who translated law into language for her. He had been her counsel, the man who taught her to see a clause as a weapon and a promise as property. He had also been, in the softer era of their life, the man she had married. Outside the glass, a nurse pushed a cart. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and cheap coffee. He stepped closer, voice lowered, as if confiding a conclusion rather than confessing a cruelty. "If she were gone," he continued, "no contest, no public fight. Everything we need falls into place." The words landed like an indictment. Elena, who had once sat behind mahogany and delivered sentences that altered fortunes, listened to the man who had drafted their prenuptial arrangements and murmured the terms of betrayal. For a moment she let the sound wash over her. It was an inflection point made audible. She could feel in that slow, careful space the angle of her life shifting toward a task that would require patience more than force. He did not know she could hear him. He never imagined she would survive long enough to transform hearing into strategy. That thought, his underestimation, was the first small advantage she filed away. If you like stories of comeback and quiet law, subscribe and stay with us. The past, in Elena's mind, unfurled like a series of exhibits. Each memory was a labeled folder. Exhibit A, her father, a founder with calloused hands and an appetite for risk. Exhibit B, the company she inherited, an empire of patents and servers that hummed like a sleeping engine. Exhibit C, Vincent Hale, whose smile first arrived in a conference room and who later, with the same practiced manner, advised her where to sign. He had been indispensable, a man who could render the complicated into terms she could use to defend herself. He had been everything she thought she needed, an interpreter between law and life, a steady hand in shareholder storms. She had not always been public about the parts of her past that read like headline shorthand. There had been a time when Elena's name, Castellano, appeared in briefs and judgments rather than in society pages. A time when she wore robes and the weight those robes implied without fanfare. That life had been, by her own choice, something she folded into a private pocket. She had stepped away from the bench after years of presiding over cases that left her with a certain appetite for clarity and a skepticism of theatrical suffering. Her withdrawal was not scandalous. It was a retreat into a life where she could be simply Elle, the heiress, a woman who ran a company and navigated marriages and boardrooms with an engineer's willingness to test what might break. Vincent arrived at the company like someone who had been rehearsing for a part. Precise, deferential at first, then indispensable. He made contracts read like counsel's prayers, clear, comforting, final. He sat beside her at annual dinners and proposed with a ring that was more a ledger than a jewel, promising to be an asset both personal and professional. Friends called him devoted. Investors called him savvy. Elena called him the man who could take complex liability and render it clean. But loyalties calcify, and in a culture where influence translates to ownership, the distinction between for her and for himself blurred. Ambition is like water. It seeks a crack and widens it. The first cracks were small, a misdirected comment here, an excluded signature there. Then came the affair, never explicit in Elena's mind as a scene, but as a series of decisions made by someone who had learned to put personal desire on the same ledger line as corporate advancement. Natasha Williams, her closest friend for years, supplied the human logic for the betrayal. Natasha's loyalty had been an asset until it was spent. Together, Vincent and Natasha turned private possibility into a strategy of accumulation. The slow betrayals read, in retrospect, like the development of a hostile takeover. Patience, patience, then a sudden and coordinated motion to seize control. The crash was, in the company's chronology, more than an accident. It became a hinge. A delivery van on an icy morning, a moment's inattention, a twisted metal lie that would change how Elena spent her days. She woke to a room of white and strangers and the breathless efficiency of emergency procedure. Her body had been betrayed by physics. Her mind, still sharp, arrived clipped and precise. They spoke to her in facts, fractures, swelling, a prognosis that prompt-mouthed doctors could not soften. Paralysis was a word the nurses told the family in subdued tones. Permanent mobility impairment was how the insurance companies labeled it. To anyone who had not listened to Vincent in the corridor, it may have looked like catastrophe. To Elena, still cataloging, it looked like a test of character. The testworthiness of a crisis had a moral language she understood. Who would step forward, and for what reason? On the third day, when the gowns were still stiff with hospital starch and the television in the corner ran a morning anchor's soft insistence, Vincent paced near the bay window and made the calculation audible. He spoke to Natasha, lowering his voice until the words were a blade. "If we can make the case that she's incapacitated indefinitely," he said, "we can reshape the narrative. We make the company look vulnerable, and we step in as the ones who saved it. People will thank us. We'll own the story. There are ways to betray without striking. There are ways to arrange circumstances so that your absence appears as a favor." Vincent's plan was not an attempt at subtlety. It was legalism applied to personal ambition, a staged misfortune, amplified headlines, an appearance of heroic stewardship. It was easy to calculate. It was harder to imagine that someone on the receiving end of such an analysis would be awake and listening. Elena's decision crystallized not from rage but from the arithmetic of survival. Rage was unproductive. Spectacle gave him the victory he craved. She did not need to rage. She needed to be surgical. The years on the bench had taught her to value restraint. There are judges who clap at the end of trial, and there are judges who wait for the quiet after the docket clears. Elena had become the latter. Her mind, even in a body that betrayed her, arranged things like a court docket, evidence, witnesses, time. Vincent, for all his craft, had missed one variable: Elena's capacity to plan around appearances. He assumed absence equaled weakness. He had been trained to recognize power in motion. He was less prepared to recognize power in stillness. She gathered a small inner council. James Harrison, a lawyer who had once worked across the table from Vincent and whose loyalty had been tested and proven, was among the first she trusted. James was not theatrical. He was a man who kept a ledger of ethics and who, when necessary, blurred the ledger to protect a client acting within the law. Patricia Morrison, a former CFO who knew where the company kept its pulse, was another. Michelle Torres, a public relations operative who had salvaged reputations after storms, closed the circle. Each brought a discipline that mirrored the tasks ahead: legal, financial, narrative. Elena's plan, in its skeleton, had three aims: protect the assets, expose the betrayal, and reclaim the moral high ground. She refused theatrics that cheapened justice. She wanted clarity, not vengeance. She wanted a record: witness statements, transaction logs, bank trails. She wanted the world to see not a tantrum but a verdict. A trusted physician, Dr. Alvarez, became an uneasy partner in the performance. He was not the sort who would falsify records for a fee, and Elena did not suggest he would. Instead, she asked for honesty delivered on a knife edge. For him to explain the most plausible worst-case prognosis to the family and the press, and for him to be sparing with definitive statements so that later, in the hands of evidence, nuance could be proven. The doctor agreed to deliver truth with emphasis, to let the appearance of hopelessness do its work without fabricating it. Even this ethical compromise, framed as a strategic choice, felt like walking along a precipice. Elena acknowledged it as such. She made no attempt to hide that some of what they would present to the world would be performance, but she also ensured that the reality underneath was protected through legal measures she kept private and technical enough to avoid instructing anyone. In private, they executed what Michelle called a legal theater. The phrase had been amused, then bitter. They created a narrative of corporate collapse, selective leaks, a press release that hinted at mismanagement, an unanticipated liquidity shortfall, in a source that blamed the CEO's inability to oversee operations. They did not, in fact, transfer assets to anonymous accounts or dissipate value. They used legal tools, escrows, contingency trusts, protected clauses, to place core holdings beyond the immediate line of claim. James drew a thin but impenetrable shield around the company's most valuable intellectual property. Patricia reorganized the visible balance sheet so the public picture suggested bankruptcy while the true assets lay invisible, quietly guarded. To do so, they resorted to ambiguity rather than forgery. They created the appearance of collapse without permitting actual destruction. They did not instruct anyone how to do the illegal. They merely used the letter of the law for all its peculiarities to create space between appearance and reality. Elena insisted that everything be documented, that attorneys who advised on the moves be named, and that any gray choices be signed off with notarized reservations. There was a moral architecture to her duplicity. She wanted to be able to show a court, even the court of public opinion, that the deception was defensive, not predatory. Vincent took the bait. He moved with the speed of someone recognizing opportunity. He made the public statements, grief-struck, decisive, and in private, he moved money. Bank accounts labeled joint and operational were emptied into accounts he claimed to control on the grounds of emergency stewardship. He filed for temporary conservatorship. He arranged for press interviews in which his voice was steady and in which he praised his own courage. Natasha took on the role of bereaved confidant in public, appearing on camera with tears she could manufacture as easily as she manufactured loyalty. In board meetings, she voted for decisions that eroded Elena's visible stewardship. They called it the competent thing to do. They called it decisive guardianship. Behind closed doors, though, Vincent and Natasha celebrated as if the theft were a banquet. When Elena learned of the emptying of the accounts, she felt the old, clean clarity she once felt at the bench. This was a case. Evidence mattered. Motive mattered. Theft was a crime, so were misrepresentations to shareholders. She cataloged the accounts and their drains, the signatures on transfers, the timestamps that overlapped with late-night calls. She directed James to assemble a ledger of law, statutes, precedents, potential claims. Litigation would follow. But litigation is a spool that unravels slowly. She would need something immediate, proof that the public would accept. She needed to transform private accounting into public testimony. Meanwhile, she cultivated the image of the irreversible. Dr. Alvarez made public statements that tilted toward the bleak. The media, hungry for narrative, published pieces about the brilliant executive felled by fate. The company stock dipped in the absence of a visible leader. Competitors called shareholders with sympathetic words and aggressive offers. Vincent spoke at a hastily arranged press conference about stability and continuity, his hands folded in a manner she had once admired, now repulsive in its trained ease. Natasha was always at his side. Months passed. Rehabilitation became a theater as well, part necessity, part ruse. Elena endured the long, unglamorous work of physical therapy. She learned to move around in a body that remembered how to be held, but had to relearn how to be driven by will. She hated therapists who simplified pain into metaphors. Pain was mechanical, she thought. So too was recovery. It came in disciplined repetition, in appointments and small triumphs. Each regained flexion in a finger felt like a count on a ledger. She practiced speeches in the evenings, legal cadence in her mouth until it sounded natural again. Strategy requires rehearsal, and the courtroom was nothing if not a place where practice mattered. Throughout that season, she kept a faint trail of clues to the other life she had lived. A brittle photograph on her mantel, an older portrait of a girl in a gown, robed and stern, sat underneath a velvet clock in the parlor of a property she had kept private. A stack of dog-eared legal journals in a locked drawer bore her name in a neat hand. A newspaper clipping, yellowed at the corner, alluded to a ruling that had become a precedent, the sort of thing lawyers cite in briefs to make the other side flinch. These were small things, not brags. She had hidden more than she had revealed. But it was important that, should the moment require it, she could produce an identity that carried weight beyond the spectacle of a wealthy heiress. Her inner circle rehearsed their lines as carefully as if preparing for a trial. Michelle prepared press packets that suggested resignation and grief. Patricia rehearsed financial statements that displayed erosion but not annihilation. James compiled affidavits and prepared subpoenas for any attempt Vincent might make to cover his tracks. They were careful, legal-minded, and weary. None of them delighted in the charade. None of them felt comfortable with the theater of decline. Yet they understood the need for strategy when the alternative was to be consumed by those they had trusted. The world took sides in public. Those who had once argued for Elena's vision either moved to distance themselves or to shore up their own positions. The board fractured. Investors sent terse letters demanding immediate answers. Analysts speculated about liquidation. Vincent answered with a confidence that tasted to Elena like contempt. He began to walk taller in press photos. He took meetings with activists and consulted with bankers whose names were whispered in investor circles. He assumed control, or rather, he assumed the appearance of control. But appearances are fragile. They fray at the seams when the texture of reality is pulled. Elena waited for those seams to show. She did not desire vengeance for its own sake. What she desired was the accounting of truth. She wanted to restore the ledger not by spectacle alone, but by substance, a careful unspooling of the evidence of betrayal in a way that the market, the courts, and the public could see, and that would not leave open the claim that she had engineered a cynical self-dealing. When the first set of subpoenas went out, Vincent's supporters cried foul. They called it harassment, a vendetta by a broken woman. Natasha posted a letter on her social feed, full of platitudes about loyalty and resilience, casting the narrative in the language of personal tragedy rather than corporate crime. The board split along predictable lines. Those who benefited from the new, messy equilibrium aligned with Vincent, and those who held longer-term stakes in the company's integrity waited on Elena, quietly sending messages of concern that did not commit them publicly. The slow legal machine whirred into motion. James filed motions, placed holds, and signaled to regulators that questions needed answering. Elena watched the world tilt toward a contest she had always believed she could win if she managed the tempo. The media loved a comeback narrative. They loved to pit the fallen hero against the supposed savior. She let them cast the play. She would not perform the role they expected. Vincent, for his part, did not hide in arrogance. He made gestures that suggested consolidation. Partnerships announced with flamboyant press releases, a charity gala where his picture, handsome, composed, graced the glossy programs. His actions were, in many ways, the predictable moves of a man eager to rebrand theft as stewardship. Those around him drank the wine of their own rhetoric. During those months, Elena learned to listen differently. She had once listened for legal arguments. Now she listened for rhythms. The cadence of a fund transfer, the late-night chime of an encrypted message, the particular way Natasha laughed when she was pleased. She collected these sounds like artifacts. Each one would be a line of testimony when needed. There were moments when self-doubt loosened its grip. She wondered whether the machinery of law would move quickly enough to deprive Vincent of his ill-gotten advantage. She worried that the public's attention would wander and that a new scandal would eclipse the old one. But her training, both as a judge and as a woman who had overseen companies, tempered the fear. Patience, she reminded herself, is not the same as passivity. It is strategy in a waiting room. In private, small acts reminded her of the life she had been building separate from the bench. The feel of paper under her palm, the weight of a book on her lap, the sound of the city beyond her windows. She practiced walking along the length of her house with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who measures steps. She measured outcomes the way the world measures sentences, by the consequences they produce. She wanted to ensure that when the reveal came, it would be a matter of record, not melodrama. Then came the day when a paper envelope, heavy and perfumed in a way that suggested money had bought the design, was delivered to the estate's concierge. The handwriting on the envelope was precise, all loops in capital letters, an invitation. It glinted with the sort of curated light only carefully arranged social calendars can produce. Inside, on thick stock, in an embossed font, The date of a wedding and the names of the couple were printed in a civilized but unmistakable way: Vincent Hale and Natasha Williams. They had not bothered to hide the intent. The invitation read as an act of triumph. It was an invitation to watch them celebrate, to witness their union premised on what they had seized. It arrived at the estate as if to say, "Come and see the life we have built out of your supposed ruin." She held the card for longer than a minute, then two. The paper made a faint, almost judicial snap when she closed it. Her first reaction was not of joy or revenge. It was a measured curiosity. They had chosen a public stage. They wanted witnesses. That had been his plan all along, to remake theft into story and to then claim the audience's sympathy. He had not anticipated, perhaps, that she would accept the invitation. She informed Michelle, via a short message that read like a line on a docket, that she would attend. Not as a broken woman, not as a supplicant. She would attend as a witness and as a judge in her own right, though the world did not yet know the depth of that title. She did not, in that moment, announce the truth of her past life. She merely placed a pin on their calendar, a subtle signal to those around her that the social theater they had chosen would now be a place of reckoning. The circle tightened. James began quietly to prepare processes that would turn the public spectacle into an evidentiary hearing. Patricia reviewed sponsor lists and traced transfers to charitable foundations and investment vehicles. Michelle prepared to shape the narrative in a way that would not rely on theatrics but would instead present what the law could not ignore: suspicious transfers, conflicts of interest, and the cruel choreography of betrayal. Elena's recovery, painstaking and private, continued in the intervals. Each physical victory, an hour standing, a measured step down a hallway, was catalogued, not as an act of defiance, but as proof that she retained agency. She would not walk in as a martyr. She would not ask the world for pity. She would speak with the kind of brevity and force her former office demanded. There would be no invective. There would be evidence and an adjudication performed in the court of public scrutiny, if not in a courtroom itself. Nightly she rehearsed the words she might use. They were not speeches so much as propositions. This is what happened. This is who profited. This is the record. She practiced saying, "I am Elena Castellano," and letting the syllables fall heavy with the authority they implied. The mantle of her former position was something she had kept private, not out of shame, but out of an understanding that power sometimes works better when quietly possessed. Yet when the time came, she would produce whatever proof was necessary: a photograph of a bench, a published ruling, a letter from clerks who remembered her spine. She would not surprise the world with trivia. She would surprise them with the inevitability of a verdict. There was an ethics to the performance Elena had designed. She wanted the moral lesson to be clear without indulging in cruelty. The world needed to see the consequences of taking loyalty for granted. She wanted to teach, in a way, that character has a cost and that building fortunes on the expenditure of another's truth invites correction. She would not craft an elaborate revenge porn of humiliation. She wanted her opponents to face consequences proportionate to their acts. Theft, if proven, would be treated as theft. As the wedding day approached, the small team tightened the screws on their preparations. Notices were sent. Legal counsel was instructed to be present in the room for any attempts at obstruction. They were careful to avoid anything that would cross clear legal boundaries. The appearance of bankruptcy had been theatrical. The exposure of embezzlement would be procedural. Elena wanted the story to be ironclad. On the eve of the wedding, she sat in the parlor with the photograph on the mantel and a glass of water cool against her lips. The house was quiet in that way estates become after business hours, a hush held like breath. She thought of her father, how he had taught her that legacies were fragile, that stewardship required more than money. It required moral courage. She thought of the bench and the quiet of the courtroom when the last witness had left, and the gavelled silence insisted on attention. She thought, too, of Vincent, of the way trust bends under the weight of desire, and of Natasha, the friend who had chosen complicity. There was time before the ceremony. There were motions to file and hearings to set and witnesses to prepare. But there was also a private satisfaction in understanding the shape of the moment to come. She had rehearsed the cadence of her words until they sat in her mouth like good law. She had prepared to present evidence in a way the public could understand. She had ensured, with all the tools at her disposal, that the company's true assets were shielded from the performative dispossession they had attempted. And so, with the invitation folded beside her like a small yet damning exhibit, she allowed herself one small smile. It was not triumph so much as a satisfaction that justice might be forthcoming in its most public form: exposure. Not all retribution would be seismic. Some of it would be the slow collapse of reputations and the withdrawal of funding when investors, faced with facts, decided that association was too costly. Those collapses would be the sort that left no consolation dinners or glossy gallery spreads, just the dull sound of phone calls stopping and bank lines drying up. She rose then, moved through the house with the precise economy of someone who had learned to measure each step. She felt, finally, the alignment of intention and action, a rare moment when plan and patience converge. The next act would be public. The world would see two people take the stage, certain of their victory. They had built a life on the assumption that she was gone. She would enter their parody of triumph and offer them a different kind of sentence: exposure. Outside, the city hummed with its unaware commerce. Inside, Elena closed the door on the parlor and walked toward the study where James waited with a file of last-minute exhibits. The night felt like a held breath before a verdict. She placed the wedding invitation on the desk between them, like a small thing of paper that somehow contained a large, unfolding truth. "We'll need witnesses," James said. "We'll need everything," Elena replied, and there was in her voice the precise tone she had once used to deliver rulings: short, decisive, without flourish. The plan that had grown from the quiet of a hospital room spread its roots into the public sphere now. The wedding was not simply an insult. It was a summons. She would answer. They moved like people who had rehearsed modesty as armor. James closed the file with a soft, definite sound, paper on paper, then slid it under a leather folio. Patricia checked the guest and sponsor lists again, tracing names with a fingertip that had once read balance sheets the way others read tea leaves. Michelle tapped through her presentation notes, each slide a quiet trapdoor intended to open under the weight of evidence. The house exhaled around them, curtains that had been drawn to a perfect line, the mantel where the old portrait watched with its carved eyes. Outside, the city continued to be indifferent. "There are cameras," Michelle whispered. "We will not rely on theatrics. We will let the documents speak." Elena inclined her head. The phrase, "let the documents speak," felt like a judicial aphorism, and in that moment she recognized the comfort of a familiar cadence. She thought of the hospital corridor, the perfunctory cruelty of a man who assumed motion equaled power. Motion had not been the true measure. It was time to show what steadiness could do. They traveled light on the day. No ostentation, just a black dress that was nothing and therefore everything. Security was discreet, the kind that dissolves into the background until a moment calls for its presence. Inside her clutch was the small kit James insisted upon: certified copies, encrypted drives, witness affidavits, and a photograph. A high-resolution image of a signed transfer that bore Vincent's thumbprint and a timestamp that contradicted his public statements. It was ugly, and therefore perfect. The venue had been chosen by design. Not a private estate where favors could be called in, but a bright ballroom in a hotel whose management had prided itself on neutrality, where the geometry of chandeliers and columns hosted plenty of eyes, and where any attempt at obstruction would risk immediate notice. The couple, Vincent Hale and Natasha Williams, had selected it to show off the alliances they had made. Sponsors' logos glinted on the programs. Investors and journalists would be present. So would a slice of the city's social class that treats scandal like an accessory. Guests arrived in ordered streams. There were those who genuinely thought themselves amused parties, curious to see the fall from a distance. There were investors in dark ties who had already started to hedge publicly. There were journalists who carried notepads, but also old grudges about the company's tussles with the press. A string quartet tuned, and the notes bled into conversations that asked the same question in different keys. Was she really coming? When Elena entered, the sound shifted. Not because she arrived with fanfare, she did not, but because in a room accustomed to spectacle, Presence itself can be loud. Heads turned for reasons that were partly curiosity and partly a recognition of a name that had been minimized in the press's tidy narrative. She walked with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed pain into patience. The click of her heels on the marble floor punctured the murmurs like a metronome. Her entrance was a precise act, measured, unornamented, resolute. Vincent's smile faltered when he saw her. It was a human flicker that betrayed the calculation beneath his practiced composure. Natasha, seated beside him, blinked and rearranged a necklace as if the small gesture could rearrange the facts. They had expected a ghost, a woman reduced to a cautionary note in their triumph. They had prepared themselves to be applauded for their resilience. The room had not prepared itself for a jurist's calm. For a moment, social niceties tried to reassert themselves. A few people rose, awkward and polite. The maitre d' signaled with a practiced manner. The MC, some glossy voice hired for the evening, began the predictable preamble about love, consolidation, and the courage of partnership. Vincent stood and bowed as if to accept the world's applause. Elena walked to the center of the room. She could have positioned herself at the edge, let the law find its way through the courts. That was not her aim. She had chosen this stage because it offered immediacy, and because a public verdict can sometimes do what a slow proceeding cannot. It can change the calculus of support in the marketplace and tilt reputations in a single terrible turn. "May I have your attention?" she asked. Her voice found the room the way a gavel finds silence. An expectation answered. No one interrupted. That silence felt heavy with potential. She did not speak of pain. She did not dramatize. She spoke as a judge might present a finding, succinctly, without rhetorical flourish, demanding that the facts be seen. "My name is Elena Castellano," she announced. The name landed with its own history, a label that carried weight because of the persons and precedents behind it. She let the sentence rest and then continued, each clause clipped and deliberate. "I presided on the bench of the appellate court for 12 years. I issued rulings that are cited in briefs. I stepped away because I wanted to see if law could live in a private life without spectacle." A ripple passed through the room. Some faces paled, some stiffened as if the balance of a conversation had shifted. A young reporter fumbled a pen. A sponsor's representative consulted his phone. The world had been given new facts, and facts have the habit of making the comfortable uncomfortable. She removed from her clutch the photograph James had marked in red, an image of a wire transfer that contradicted Vincent's public conservatorship claims. "This document," she said, "shows money moved from accounts labeled joint operations into accounts he claimed authority over. The transfer was signed with Mr. Hale's authorization at 2:17 a.m., on a night when he was on the record saying he had done everything to protect the company." There was a low sound that could have been the string quartet faltering or the collective intake of breath. She continued, not allowing sentiment to wedge the flow. "These transfers are not an accident," she said. "They are evidence. They are testimony. They are the kind of things a judge looks at when deciding whether someone has acted in fiduciary bad faith." She spoke of law because law was her native language now. The cadence of her sentences made the room feel like a civic space, not judgmental theater, but inquiry. She did not try to fall a long way into the past with invective. She simply placed exhibits between the audience and the story they'd been told. James stepped forward then, presenting charts that neutrals could follow. Timestamps, overlapping authorizations, phone logs that placed Vincent on the line with transfer approvals. He did not scream corruption. He presented arithmetic. Patricia explained, in dry terms, how the company had been reorganized by the press's narrative to look precarious while essential assets were moved in protective instruments, escrows, trusts, contingencies, safe but not opaque enough to evade scrutiny later. She emphasized that legal structures had been employed to preserve value, not to cloak it. Michelle let the press packets go out, the language clinical, precise. The most dangerous moment for the narrators was when Elena played the audio. It was a recording acquired, James explained in softly forensic terms, during a constrained period of corporate oversight. The message was not sensational because of its language, but because of its intent. It captured a man who had once been her counsel discussing contingency advantages, laughing faintly at the possibility of owning a story no one could challenge because she would be gone. The phrase in that recording, spare, almost courteous in tone, arrived at the ears in the ballroom like a legal exclamation point. No melodrama was necessary. The meaning was self-evident. Vincent rose then, white at his collar. His first instinct was to interrupt. He attempted to speak, to summon the narrative of heroism he'd rehearsed. But the room no longer belonged solely to him. Investors who had lent their names to him shifted in their seats. Cameras captured the tilt of his jaw. A journalist, professional curiosity warring with a human sense of watching a man lose the account he's been spinning, asked a pointed follow-up about the timing of the transfers. Vincent's words scrambled for purchase. He spoke of emergency measures, of stewardship in crisis, of being forced to make hard choices. He described the arrangements as necessary and temporary, rhetoric intended to reframe theft into service. Natasha moved to his side and spoke about grief and strength. Performance tried to reclaim the narrative. But sometimes performance collides with documentation in a way that strips away rhetoric. When Elena presented a string of subpoenaed emails, some publicly available in board minutes, some only accessible via corporate oversight requests, threads of texts revealed that Vincent had discussed anticipated movements of funds with people outside the company, people who now sat murmuring in the second row with logos on their ties. One message read like a plan, another read like a celebration. A phone rang at a table near the back. Someone answered, listened, and then hung up slowly. The skin of a partnership begins to fray at the moments when the mosaic of trust is pierced. One by one, conversations that had fed Vincent's assent began to cool. A senior investor excused himself and made a call. A bank representative tucked a program under his arm and left without fanfare. Contracts are collections of promises. When the sources of revenue evaporate, promises begin to look like liabilities. Elena did not shout victory. She did not seek to humiliate. She simply walked through the exhibits until the room's temperature had shifted from celebration to sober inquiry. She closed with a sentence that had the economy of a legal ruling. "This is not spectacle," she said. "This is evidence. You may decide that these actions are merely poor judgment. You may decide they are criminal. That is not my call tonight. My call is to present the record so the proper authorities can take the next steps. My function, my duty, is to ensure the truth is available to those who must decide." Short sentences, delivered. The hotel staff, who until that evening had viewed themselves as neutral facilitators of matrimonial joy, found themselves in the awkward position of hosts to possible litigation. Cameras zoomed on faces, and on the crestfallen smile Vincent wore like a mask melting at the edges. Sponsors who had been announced in the glossy programs now fumbled to issue statements about their own commitment to ethical stewardship. Social media churned, turning the wedding into a thread of commentary where moral outrage and schadenfreude blended in real time. Natasha reacted with what looked like bewildered offense. She had engaged in public displays of grief and partnership, but real consequences were not on the menu she'd imagined. She tried to speak of love betrayed and of complexity, but people had begun to look past the two of them at the ledger inside Elena's hands. The moral theater Natasha had planned to perforate with grief found itself marooned. Security closed ranks around the couple. Vincent demanded order, and for a time the sound of music returned to drown the fallout. But the music had lost its innocence. People who had been quick to applaud a narrative of rescue now wondered whether applause had supported theft. Outside the ballroom, a reporter approached a representative from one of Vincent's new funding partners. He was blunt. "Do you maintain your relationship given these allegations?" The man did not answer immediately. Even the language of measured denials sounded brittle. Contracts were discussed in a whisper. Phone calls were made right then to legal teams. The market reacts quickly in the world of capital. Rumor, once married to evidence, moves like a contagion. By the time the ceremony's first course arrived, sponsors had begun to withdraw public support. Two investment firms issued statements citing unforeseen developments and promising to convene emergency reviews. A philanthropic partner declared the need for clarity. The words were cautious, but the subtext was unmistakable. Reputation is currency here as much as money. If association becomes a liability, withdrawal becomes the rational move. Vincent realized then the scale of what had been lost. He had built momentum on a public narrative that would not bear the weight of documentary contradiction. He had turned private ambition into public theater, yet he had not anticipated that the public might ask for records. The very openness he had once used as camouflage now exposed him. When the first calls came, tone sharp, voices professional, Valerie, the representative for a major bank who had been pictured with the couple on announcement posts, texted one word to a contact: pause. Within an hour, several names appeared in the newswires as reassessing engagement. Contracts for advisory roles were placed under review. Dinner conversations became boardroom ones. The cost of being associated with questionable governance rose with a corrosive speed. Vincent stood at the center of it, grasping for the narrative he had always used, that his intervention had been necessary. He was clever with argument, but clumsy in crisis. His ability to negotiate language in private was a tool. Under public light, it became a mirror showing how much he'd polished the surface while neglecting the foundation. As the evening wore, lawyers representing various stakeholders began to converge. Emails were exchanged. Notices were drafted. The ballroom, which had been a theater of celebration, transformed into an arena of inquiries. Elena left before dessert. She did not linger to witness the slow unraveling. That was not her drama to perform. She had done what she had intended, presented a body of evidence in public that would tip the scales of reputation and set in motion formal scrutiny. The law, procedural and deliberate, would do the rest. Outside, the air was cool and blunt. Cameras flashed as Elena made her way to the car, but the lights could not capture the quietness that followed trained action. She had always thought of justice as a series of measured moves. Tonight, she had made one such move where it would matter, where people who had once been willing to bend could now no longer pretend ignorance. The fallout was immediate in the market and methodical in the corridors of power. Within 48 hours, several major investors issued statements withdrawing planned funding contingent upon an independent audit. A regulatory office acknowledged receipt of a formal complaint and announced a review. News outlets that had run breathless profiles of Vincent's stewardship now appended cautious language about allegations. The social feeds that had once celebrated the couple now offered a mixture of condemnation and weary resignation. There were, as there often are, those who cried foul on technicalities. Did Elena's staging of a public collapse amount to manipulation? Some commentators raised that exact question, especially those who saw in her actions a kind of mirror of Vincent's own. She had constructed an appearance of ruin to expose embezzlement. She had enlisted a doctor to deliver a bleak prognosis to heighten the effect. Critics argued that such tactics risked moral equivalence. If you practice deception for righteous ends, are you not also complicit in the same ethical compromise? Elena had anticipated that charge. She did not find it a surprise. She had chosen, carefully and with reservations she had spoken of to no one, to employ legal ambiguity as a shield while protecting real assets. She had insisted every step be documented. She had ensured that contingency trusts and escrow arrangements were created under the advisement of attorneys whose names would be recorded. She had not instructed forgery or illegal transfers. Instead, she had made the public ledger read one way, while the legal record preserved the truth. That distinction was a narrow one in the court of public opinion, but in the actual courtrooms and regulatory hearings that would follow, such distinctions matter. A few legal scholars, breathless with the opportunity to opine, published columns exploring the ethical tightrope she had walked. Some described her move as defensive deception, others as lawyering the public. Several conceded that her measures may well have saved the company's core assets from dissipation. Yet the commentators concluded, almost uniformly, that whether admiration or condemnation followed would depend less on taste than on the formal findings that regulators and prosecutors would reach. Vincent, forced into reaction, issued a statement that read like an attempt to reclaim dignity. "My actions were intended only to preserve stability," he said. "I regret any appearance to the contrary." His lawyers prepared a counter-narrative, citing emergency clauses and conservatorship precedents. Natasha issued a statement that spoke of love complicated by circumstances. Neither statement ended the story. The law has its pace, reputations do not. In the weeks that followed, subpoenas were issued. Auditors examined ledgers and found irregularities. Transfers that had been made under the pretext of emergency and corresponding withdrawals that benefited entities now linked to Vincent through shell companies and consultants. Several of those entities were connected to people who had eaten at the same tables and taken the same photographs. The web, once photogenic, looked tangled and self-interested under forensic light. Regulators moved with the glacial pace they are prone to. They also moved with a professionalism that reflected the seriousness of the claims. Inquiries became investigations. Investigations produced interviews, statements, and sometimes, if documents were clear enough, charges. The city's public prosecutor's office announced an investigation into possible misappropriation of corporate funds. The language of legal processes replaced the language of gossip. Vincent's professional network shrank. Board positions evaporated as fiduciary concerns were raised. A boutique consulting firm that had announced a collaboration quickly backed away, citing unforeseen circumstances. The image of a man whose career was made by advising others on trust and contracts became complicated by the optics of impropriety. He fought back with counsel, with press releases, with an attempt to paint Elena as vengeful. But the balance of evidence had shifted. In high finance, the smell of risk drives even the most committed allies to disassociate. Natasha's social capital turned to ash first. Friends who had once smiled for photos with her now descended into protective silence. Her philanthropic engagements were deferred. She found herself in a smaller circle, one made of those with similar exposure and similar reasons to avoid public reckoning. For someone who had built her persona on loyalty and proximity to power, the reversal was brutal. What Elena watched from a distance was not a private gratification, but the operation of a principle she believed in, that actions have consequences, that stewardship betrayed invites correction. She felt the hollow satisfaction of a verdict rendered not by her alone, but by the combined mechanics of law, market discipline, and public scrutiny. Justice, as she had learned to think of it, is not always dramatic. Often it is the unromantic work of those who notice and who can marshal resources to make notice matter. Critics continued to point at the ethical ambiguities in her strategy. There were op-eds that asked if she had engaged in her own brand of manipulation. She accepted that critique as part of the cost. In a public forum where every action is chewed into meaning and reassembled into slogans, simplicity is a rare commodity. Elena did not apologize for making the world apply its own standard to a man who had rewritten the rules in private. There were quieter consequences, too. Dr. Alvarez, who had agreed to frame a worst-case prognosis in stark terms, found his professional choices questioned. A medical board conducted a review into statements he had made in the press. He had not falsified records. He had chosen emphasis over reassurance. He defended his choices publicly, explaining the ethical nuance, that in a dire situation, shaping expectations can be part of honest discourse. But the board weighed the line, and the criticism stung. Elena visited him once after the storm. They spoke not in the language of defense, but of obligation. He had chosen to help her preserve a life and a legacy. His aid was not shown uncritically. It was shown to be part of a fraught moral field. James, Patricia, and Michelle weathered legal scrutiny because of the careful documentation they had kept. They had left trails meant to show intent and caution. They had insisted on notarized opinions where gray choices were present. Because of that, regulators and prosecutors found less to indict them on. Their reputations were dented, but their professionalism was not entirely discredited. They had acted in counsel to a client seeking to protect assets, and for that, the legal record protected them. Time became the deciding factor in some parts of the story. Courts take months, boards take weeks, markets take almost nothing. In the short term, Elena had achieved what she had planned. Access to evidence had transformed perception, and perception had real consequences in the markets and among partners. In the longer term, legal processes would define guilt and liability. She had expected that. She was not naive about the nature of the justice system. When formal proceedings began, she made a choice that surprised some. She recused herself from direct involvement in criminal complaints. She allowed James to pursue civil remedies and pressed for regulatory reviews, but maintained distance from the prosecutorial agenda. She had never intended to use the criminal system for vengeance. She wanted the law to work, not to be a weapon of personal ruin beyond what facts proved necessary. That restraint reinforced the moral posture she intended: clarity, not cruelty. Months later, a settlement emerged in the civil arena. A forensic audit concluded that certain transfers were inappropriate under the fiduciary duties owed. Some funds were recovered. Vincent faced the very real possibility of criminal charges, though prosecutions have their own calculus and are not guaranteed. Boards reshuffled. Natasha accepted a reduced public profile. Investors who had been cautious returned only under strict oversight and after thorough due diligence. The company, fragile under the public storm, found a way to steady itself by leaning into institutional governance and by replacing optics with oversight. It was not miraculous. It was the result of measured, technical labor. Elena watched the company she had once led find a shape suited to long-term survival. She did not climb back onto the pedestal of CEO. She did not crave the spotlight she had carefully avoided for so long. She took no celebratory interviews. She remained present at quiet meetings, making decisions when needed, advising in the margins. She preferred that the institution live beyond her drama. People asked her, sometimes in private, whether she had felt vindictive as the dominoes fell. She answered, rarely in public, always with the same steadied cadence, that she had acted to defend a legacy entrusted to her. Justice, she would say, is not personal satisfaction. It is the restoration of order to broken accounts. Short sentences. The tone of someone who has seen the law operate and who appreciates its limits. In quieter moments, she returned to the photograph on the mantel. It showed a younger woman in robes, hair pinned back, a face composed as if carved. That face had been both armor and instruction for many years. She had learned to judge not only the facts before a court, but the character of the people who stood before it. She had learned that patience, strategic patience, can be more devastating to betrayal than the immediate cry of outrage. It is a slow kind of force that bends not by storm, but by steady application. When the dust settled enough to be visible, she sat in a small hearing room with James and read through the settlement documents. There was a civility to the motions of legal closure. They were not tidy. All endings are partial. But there were tangible corrections, restitution orders, revised governance protocols, and public acknowledgments that missteps had been made. Her name remained in public filings not as a demonstration of triumph, but as a record of the contest that had been contested and resolved. In the weeks that followed, invitations to speak came less frequently than one would expect. The public had a proclivity for spectacle, and Elena never supplied the appetite. She gave a few interviews, careful, direct, untempted by melodrama. She emphasized stewardship, the obligation to act when others do not, and the necessity of restraint. Revenge cheapens justice, she said once, because it substitutes the satisfaction of the moment for the work of repair. People wrote about her in variable tones. Some framed her as a calculating avenger, others as an exemplar of cool dignity. The kind of narratives the public fashioned is rarely purely just. She let them have their versions. What mattered to her was the repair to an institution she had been entrusted with, and the accounting that made clear where moral responsibility had lain. Months after the wedding that had been intended as a coronation, a commentary piece in a national paper gave a line to a retired magistrate who had known Elena's work. "There is a moment," the piece quoted, "when a judge must decide if the law is to be used to heal or to hurt. The better instinct is to preserve what is good and to expose what is corrupt." That is the line she walked. The line pleased her not because of praise, but because it captured the centrality of purpose she'd had since the hospital corridor. An aim beyond anger, preservation and truth. On an autumn day, as light came oblique and the city smelled faintly of rain, Elena walked alone to the park near her home. She watched people move through their small private urgencies, parents shepherding children, a man practicing scales on a violin, a woman deep in conversation. The spectacle of a human life is many things, she thought, a mosaic of private choices, some generous, some fraught. It is easy to be consumed by the glaring malfeasance of a betrayal. It is harder to tend to the slow, ordinary acts that rebuild trust. She had not returned to the bench in title, though petitions arrived, quiet and flattering. She considered them and declined. The gravity of the judicial robe felt like a settled thing in the wardrobe of her life. A garment she had once worn and set aside, not because it had no value, but because she had wanted to experiment with the private exercise of stewardship. The experience had taught her that there are many ways to adjudicate wrong, in courtrooms, in markets, and sometimes in the court of public opinion when the law can be called to act. When people asked what she would have done if she had known the betrayal earlier, she acknowledged that knowledge is a strange currency. "If I had known," she said, "I would have protected the company sooner. I would have placed more outward safeguards." But the work of the law is often to respond to what has happened, not to a foregone hypothetical. The answer was not evasive. It was an admission of limits and of the humility required by stewardship. At the end of the long season, she found herself again in the parlor with the old portrait and the velvet clock. She thought of the corridor where the betrayal sentence had been spoken as casually as a schedule. She thought of the patient months of therapy and legal work, the careful gathering of evidence, the choice to confront rather than to collapse. She had not sought to crush Vincent for cruelty's sake. She had sought to restore a broken account. In doing so, she had navigated gray ethical fields and accepted their costs. As she prepared to leave, she placed the wedding invitation, now an exhibit in a case file, back onto a shelf. It looked smaller than it had that first day, a thin paper that once meant triumph, but which was now emblematic of the risks of building a life on another's duplicity. She did not smirk. She did not gloat. She had always preferred sentences to performative cruelty. At a small gathering of friends who had weathered the storm with her, she spoke quietly about patience and duty. "Patience," she said, "is not the absence of action. It is the choice of when to act." The words were simple because truth often is. There was in the room a recognition that the story was less about one woman's cleverness and more about the consequences of choices when they meet the mechanics of public scrutiny. If one asked what lesson the world should take from the spectacle of a judge revealing herself at a wedding, Elena might have offered a modest answer, that dignity and restraint remain forms of power, that the law is not a tool for personal vengeance but an instrument for repair and accountability, that those who choose betrayal will, in time, meet the consequences of the paths they pick. Her final public act regarding the matter was not dramatic. She filed the necessary motions and let the legal process continue. She sat for a deposition when requested and answered with the same measured directness she used in courtrooms. She respected the work of the prosecutors and allowed the procedures to unfold. For someone who had once been the arbiter of decisions, the patience required to sit and wait for formal processes to act was a test of character as severe as any. Weeks later, as the city prepared for winter and the scandal faded into the texture of news cycles, Elena received a letter, an invitation, but not one like the envelope that had once provoked her. This was from a legal institute inviting her to speak about stewardship and ethics. She accepted, intending to talk not about the particulars of her case, but about the obligations of power and the quiet labor of preservation. Her closing act in that season of reckoning was private. She visited a small community center where a program funded by the company provided scholarships for young women in engineering and law. The program had been at risk during Vincent's brief ascendancy. She walked through the room, listened to the students speak of ambition and doubts, and felt with a rare clarity the proper place of authority, not spectacle, but service. When she left that day, the final image she carried was not the collapsing of a man who had betrayed her, but the faces of those who would benefit from institutions that honored their obligations. That was the victory she wanted, not the ruin of an enemy but the stewardship of a future. She had come into the public eye in a moment of crisis and chosen to act with the tools she knew: law, patience, evidence. She had staged appearances and permitted ethical ambiguity where she thought it necessary to protect more than punish. She had, above all, kept her voice measured and her actions proportionate. The world would tell its versions of the story. Some will call her ruthless, others will call her resolute. She cared less for verdicts in the court of gossip than she did for the slow, persistent work of correction. A final note arrived from James, a small card that read, in neat script, "Justice, as always, requires more patience than people imagine." Elena smiled and placed it with the others. She locked the door lightly behind her and walked into the gray afternoon, a woman who had been betrayed by a man who once translated law for her and who, in return, had translated silence into strategy. The city moved on. The markets adjusted. The legal processes continued. She walked forward, not lighter for the burden of the season, but steadier for having carried it. If this story made you think about the limits of trust and the ways we defend what matters, leave a comment below and share it with someone who believes character still counts.